Welcome. We have a heavy stack of sources today. High-stakes stuff. It paints a complex and, frankly, pretty distressing picture of systemic stress right across UK institutions. This deep dive isn't just about, skimming the headlines. It's really about understanding the deep structural fault lines. We're talking policing, prisons, right through to poverty policy and political ethics at the top. It's really a study in accountability under pressure.
Thoughtful pause. Indeed. And our mission, I think, is to get past the sort of surface-level political back and forth. We need to unpack these multiple recent reports that focus on institutional failures and the really intense administrative challenges the current government's facing. What's consistently fascinating here, for me anyway, is that collision point. You've got systems designed decades ago, often analog, bureaucratic, pretty resistant to change, meeting the demands of, modern social complexity and these really acute political realities. We're basically watching archaic infrastructure buckle under contemporary weight.
Yeah, buckle is the word. And our sources today are pretty extensive. We'll kick off with a report on the Metropolitan Police. It uses exceptionally strong language, actually, to describe discrimination. Then we'll pivot to this crisis of mistaken prisoner releases, which sounds chaotic, but there's a surprisingly powerful technological solution right there in the data that we really have to dissect.
And following that institutional look, we shift focus. We look at the fiscal and ethical tightropes the government's walking. That means the intense debate around the two-child benefit cap, the painful choices forced by the Treasury's financial black hole, and also that delicate matter of political appointments and, financial transparency.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start, I think, with the institution that's faced such intense, repeated scrutiny for, decades now. UK policing. We're talking about a new report stating discrimination is literally baked into the system.
Yes, and the context of that phrase, baked in, is crucial. This is the recent internal review of anti-Black racism within the Met Police Service. The full title is 30 Patterns of Harm, a structural review of systemic racism within the London Metropolitan Police Service. It was authored by Shreen Daniels of HR Rewired. And the conclusion is, it's a severe indictment. Discrimination, it says, is baked into the Met's HR systems, its institutional design, leadership, governance, and culture. And this leads to what she actually terms racial harm.
Baked in. That's a structural term, isn't it? It implies the problem isn't just, a few bad apples, but the architecture itself. What kind of specific structural harm did Daniels document?
Well, Daniels really focused on how the institutional mechanisms, things like the standard operating procedures for promotions, for internal discipline, even just everyday interactions, how they systematically disadvantage Black staff. One of the specific harm patterns she cited is this kind of behavioral double standard. So darker-skinned staff are systematically labeled confrontational when they express concerns or opinions, whereas lighter-skinned staff doing the exact same thing might get quicker empathy or understanding, maybe more leniency. It's like the institutional filter is applying bias to subjective things like performance reviews or disciplinary actions.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly insidious.
Yeah.
Because it's not like an overt slur. There's a systemic devaluing of someone's professional way of being based on their skin tone.
Exactly. And Daniels was highly critical of any potential attempts to just paper over this with, say, diversity training. Her analysis was clear. Any plans that ignore this root-level institutional design failure. They'll only manage perception, avoid power, thus continuing the cycle of harm. She argued that real accountability has to start with, profound specificity. Her critical diagnostic finding was that anti-Blackness is the clearest indicator of organizational dysfunction.
That's a bold structural hypothesis, isn't it? It implies that if you fix the deepest form of discrimination, you inherently suck at the flaws that allow other kinds of institutional malpractice like misogyny, homophobia, general negligence to thrive. Like it's some kind of master key to organizational failure.
It connects to that idea, that if the system can fundamentally deny fairness to one group based on something visible, indelible, then it has no genuine moral or structural integrity to prevent failure elsewhere. The issue is structural integrity itself, not just individual attitudes.
And this leads us to the grim reality, which is, we've had this conversation before, repeatedly, for decades. It feels like we're stuck in a structural loop here.
It is a profound cyclical failure of institutional reform. It really is. The Daniels report draws on over 40 years of documented evidence showing this. We just had the 2023 Louise Casey review that was commissioned after the awful Sarah Everard murder, and it found the Met institutionally racist, misogynistic, and homophobic.
And of course, the history takes us right back to that seminal moment in UK policing, the 1999 Macpherson report. After the Stephen Lawrence murder investigation was mishandled, that report defined and branded the Met as institutionally racist.
26 years later, and we're talking about the same core term, applied to the same core institution. When Baroness Stephen Lawrence's mother welcomed this new report, her comment was just, well, poignant. He said it contained nothing that I did not already know. She stressed the police have to acknowledge, accept, and confront racism now, not just keep promising future change.
The current commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, he welcomed the report. He described it as powerful, recognized that further systemic, structural, cultural change is needed. He even noted a small positive sign trust among Black Londoners, apparently up 10% in 2 years. But he admitted it still trails behind others. But the core question is still there, isn't it? How do you convince the public this latest commitment is any different from the last 3 decades of commitments?
Well, you look at the data documenting the public's actual experience, this deep-seated skepticism. It's perfectly quantified in the YouGov data, specifically on public perception of police powers, like stop and search. This is where that structural reality Daniels identified translates into, measurable public distrust.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting, because the numbers just confirm the lived experience of ethnic minorities, don't they?
Yeah.
Let's look at the disparity in support for stop and search overall.
The stats are stark markers of differential trust, really stark. So, while ethnic minority Britons overall still show majority support for stop and search, it's 53% support. That's a massive 20-point gap compared to white Britons, where support is way up at 73%. But then when you break it down further, the fracture really appears. Among Black Britons specifically, support is almost perfectly split, 44% support versus 43% opposition. That indicates a real internal debate, doesn't it, within the group most affected?
That split tells you everything, really. That conflict between wanting safer streets and experiencing disproportionate policing. And when you ask about fairness and how that power is used, well, the skepticism just hardens.
It does. 6 in 10 ethnic minority Britons have little to no confidence in the police's ability to apply stop and search fairly. 6 in 10. Conversely, white Britons are narrowly split. 45% have confidence versus 40% who lack confidence. That institutional belief in impartiality, it's fundamentally absent in the minority community.
And the perception of disproportionate use is just overwhelmingly high.
Absolutely. 81% of Black Britons feel they are searched more than white Britons. And nearly 2/3, 62%, say they are searched much more. Now, this perception isn't just anecdotal, it's data validated. Government figures confirm that Black Britons are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than their white counterparts. The system is structurally 9 times more likely to interact with you under suspicion if you are Black.
Thoughtful pause. That connects perfectly back to Daniels' report, doesn't it? The system is designed to produce racial harm. But I was genuinely shocked by one final detail in that YouGov data. The confusion over the legality of the police's power.
You're referring to the legal gap.
Yeah.
31% of ethnic minority Britons mistakenly believe police can legally stop and search them based only on nationality and race. That is, unequivocally, illegal. Police have to have reasonable grounds for suspicion.
That suggests a terrifying disconnect, doesn't it? That almost a third of the population most affected by this power thinks the police are legally allowed to profile them based on race. Whether that belief comes from genuine ignorance of the law or, maybe more darkly, a resigned acceptance that the law is just irrelevant in practice, it signals a profound failure of public accountability and transparency about fundamental rights.
Precisely. It implies that the lived experience of being stopped disproportionately has essentially overridden the legal reality in people's minds. The application of power has been so relentless, so disproportionate over time, that the illegality of racial profiling has effectively failed to register in the public consciousness of the communities most targeted. That normalized injustice. That's perhaps the most damning finding of all in this data.
It seems systemic failures don't lie, and neither does carefully segmented survey data. And that brings us neatly, if depressingly, to our next major institutional stress point. This one deals with administrative failure on a staggering scale, often leading to immediate public danger, the prison crisis.
Right. So we shift now from institutional cultural failure to acute institutional administrative failure. This is the crisis centered around Wandsworth Prison. It's sort of become the poster child for a system buckling under pressure. It's seen a high-profile security failures, administrative failures, including, you remember, the 2023 escape of Daniel Khalif.
But the immediate trigger for this latest political firestorm was this cluster of high-profile, mistaken prisoner releases, all in rapid succession. Let's detail these failures because they are quite something.
Okay, the first case involved Brahim Kadur Sharif. He was a convicted sex offender, an Algerian national, serving time for trespass with intent to steal. He was mistakenly released early on October 29th. Not only released wrongly, but he was also apparently in the initial stages of deportation. When he was arrested more than a week later in North London, he initially denied who he was before eventually stating, "They released me illegally," which is, well, a hard fact to deny under the circumstances.
And the second case followed right on its heels. William Billy Smith. Released accidentally on November 3rd, the very day he was jailed for fraud. Why? Because Croydon Crown Court mistakenly told the prison his 35-month sentence was suspended. When it wasn't, it was immediate.
The paperwork failed, right at the point of communication between court and prison. Now, although Smith eventually surrendered 3 days later, these incidents were made worse by the wrongful release of another offender, Hadush Kabatu, an Ethiopian sex offender, just days before. The context is vital here. These aren't just isolated incidents. They signal a deep, chronic flaw in the Ministry of Justice's core function, which is knowing who is supposed to be locked up.
And the actual numbers behind this administrative chaos, they're genuinely alarming.
They really indicate a system in rapid decline. A massive 262 prisoners were released in error in the year ending March 2025. That represents a staggering 128% increase on the prior year. 128%. This isn't just Wandsworth. It's symptomatic of an overcrowded and overwhelmed prison system that's suffering from a lack of effective modern infrastructure.
So what does this all mean politically? The Justice Secretary, David Lammy, he inherited a system he admitted was in crisis. He stated he's determined to grip this problem, though he did acknowledge it cannot be done overnight. But the immediate political fallout was intense, wasn't it?
It was, and the core cause of the political liability really centered on Lammy's perceived lack of transparency. He faced severe criticism for not immediately revealing the specific details of Kadur Sharif's release during Prime Minister's questions. Lammy's defense was, look, he liked all the detail at that specific moment and didn't want to mislead the House by giving incomplete information.
Starmer defended Lammy on that point, didn't he? Saying he set out the facts to the best of his knowledge. But the opposition rightly stressed that mistakes like these are simply intolerable, regardless of the political defense. But you touched on the actual core problem earlier, which is just utterly fascinating in how outdated it is.
Yes. The technological Achilles heel of the British justice system. The core cause of these errors has been officially identified as an archaic, paper-based system for prisoner records. Former Justice Secretary Lord Michael Gove highlighted that the system still uses, wait for it, fax machines. Fax machines.
Yeah. Laugh softly. That is almost unbelievable for a high-security penal system, responsible for managing complex sentences, deportation processes. We're talking life and liberty decisions relying on 1980s office tech and the reliability of a physical bit of paper traveling between departments.
It's a classic example of bureaucratic inertia, isn't it? You have complex legal procedures needing precision and speed, but they rely on paper forms, fax confirmations, manual data entry across multiple institutions, the prison, the court, the home office. The likelihood of human error just skyrockets. Translating a sentence from a court document to a handwritten prison ledger, a fax going missing, or being illegible, it's practically an institutional guarantee of failure.
But what's fascinating here, maybe a bit hopeful, is that the sources pivot directly from this mess to pointing towards a successful technological counter-solution. The implementation of prisoner self-service technology. PSS.
Yes, this is where we can apply some rigor, some data science to operational reform. The sources highlight a really robust study, a natural stepped wedge study. It examined the impact of installing these PSS kiosks in 13 UK prisons over a 7-year period. So this wasn't just a quick pilot, it was a sustained, comprehensive analysis.
What was the main goal of introducing PSS? What were they trying to achieve?
2 main goals, really. First, enhancing operational efficiency, reducing officer workload tied up in basic admin tasks. Second, and maybe more profound, was preparing prisoners for re-entry into, a modern, digitally sophisticated society, and crucially, encouraging self-responsibility.
How does a kiosk do that?
Well, these PSS kiosks allow prisoners to independently handle a whole range of basic tasks that previously needed an officer to process a piece of paper. Things like ordering canteen food, buying items from the prison shop, checking their financial accounts, booking family visits, applying for education programs. It essentially removes the bureaucratic friction from just mundane daily life inside.
And what was the measurable impact on behavior inside the prison? Because that environment is often fraught with tension.
The effect was statistically significant and pretty immediate, too. PSS installation led to a rapid and measurable reduction in disciplinary adjudications. That's internal misconduct reports by Gamma, with Wales 0.49.
Okay, gamma 0.49. We need to translate that for our listener. What does that actually tell us about the change in the prison environment?
Right. So it indicates a moderate to large effect size and reduction, a significant drop. The study interpreted this change as a direct result of removing those common sources of tension and disputes. The frustrations caused by slow, paper-based requests. Did my order go through? Why haven't I heard back about my visit? Where's my money? Those simply disappeared when prisoners got instant, visible access to their own information and services. Basically, when you reduce administrative friction, you reduce hostility.
Oh, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The system stops feeling like this arbitrary, slow-moving bureaucratic wall and starts feeling more like a predictable utility you can use. But the ultimate test of any rehabilitation effort has to be the impact on reoffending once people leave prison, right?
Absolutely. And this, for me, is the most compelling piece of data in the entire source stack we're looking at today. Reoffending in the first year after release was reduced by a massive 5.36% absolute reduction in the prisons with PSS kiosks.
Wait a minute, 5.36%. How did that compare to the control groups, the prisons without the kiosks?
Well, compared to similar comparison prisons over the same period, which only saw a tiny 0.78% reduction, the PSS prisons achieved a nearly seven-fold greater reduction in reoffending, 7 times better. The statistical association for this reduction was strong. It was measured by an effect size of R equals 0.54.
Incredulously. Are you serious?
Yeah.
An administrative digital change kiosks replacing fax machines and paper slips correlated with a greater than 5% absolute reduction in reoffending. That's huge in penal policy terms.
I am always serious when discussing predicted validity and quantified rehabilitation. Slight chuckle. But yes, to translate the technical bit, R equal 0.54 is considered a large effect size in social science research. It strongly supports the hypothesis that improved in-prison behavior and engagement, which seems to be driven by the PSS kiosks, predicts reduced reoffending after release.
Wow. So what was the mechanism behind that phenomenal change? Was it just about making things run smoother or something deep?
The study argues it was primarily psychological and behavioral. The prisoner survey showed 55% of respondents confirmed PSS gave them more control. And this fundamentally shifted them from a state of enforced dependency to self-responsibility. They managed their own basic tasks, their finances, their scheduling. That sense of agency is crucial for preparing for release. Furthermore, 43% said they gained more or much more confidence in dealing with IT-enabled services for the outside world. It directly helps bridge that digital divide they'd face upon release.
That is a phenomenal example of effective, data-backed, technological and process reform. It shows the systems can be fixed, often by empowering the people using them. Now, that positive story contrasts sharply with the other major system under profound strain we need to discuss, welfare and economic policy.
Yeah, we transition now from the quantifiable failures of physical security and admin to the ethical and financial failures embedded in the social safety net. We're focusing here on the highly controversial two-child benefit cap. This is really about legislative design that actively promotes or at least fails to prevent child poverty.
Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown recently jumped into this debate, didn't he? Demanding the total abolition of this cap ahead of the budget. Let's just remind the listener what the policy actually is.
Right. It was introduced by George Osborne nearly a decade ago now. The cap basically bars families from claiming the child element of universal credit, which is currently around 292 hours a month for any third child or subsequent children born after April 2017. The stated intent behind it was to ensure people on benefits faced, quote, the same financial choices as those in work when deciding to have more children.
But the argument against it, mainly from charities like CPAG, hinges on the fact that children don't choose when or where they're born, and that the cap is purely punitive towards the child. What's the human cost, according to the data?
Well, according to figures compiled by the Child Poverty Action Group and others, charities argue the policy is directly responsible for pushing hundreds of thousands of children into poverty. even destitution. The quantitative impact of abolishing it would be profound. They estimate it would instantly lift 350,000 children out of poverty, and it would also substantially reduce the depth of poverty for another 800,000 children.
And what's the cost of the Treasury for doing that?
The estimated cost for total abolition is around £2 billion annually, so that's the price tag, if you like, of lifting those 350,000 children out of poverty.
And the daily accrual of harm is just staggering. Every single day, the cap remains in place. Another 109 children are calculated as being pulled into poverty by this policy. Brown's intervention was particularly forceful because he didn't just call for tinkering, did he? He wanted complete removal.
His language was strongly ethical, yes. He argued that total abolition is far preferable to any tapering, any partial reform. He said it was necessary to remove the stain on the legislative book of legislation that, in his view, inculcates prejudice. He clearly sees it as morally repugnant legislation, placing that moral argument far above any fiscal savings.
That ethical debate, though, is running straight into the brick wall of immediate fiscal reality facing the Treasury. Chancellor Rachel Reeves is staring down a major financial problem ahead of the autumn budget, isn't she?
She certainly is. She's facing a fiscal black hole estimated at nearing 30 billion pounds. Now, that gap comes from a combination of things. Lower than expected economic growth, high borrowing costs, necessary future spending commitments. This massive shortfall is forcing the government's hand on some incredibly tough tax choices.
And those choices directly threaten a key political promise they made.
Precisely. Reeves is reportedly telling the fiscal watchdog, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, that she will raise income tax. This directly contradicts the manifesto promise, often called the tax lock, not to raise income tax, national insurance, or VAT on working people.
The proposed way around this, to navigate the political and fiscal chasm, involves a very specific tax swap. Can you tell us about the mechanics of this 2P tax swap and who it actually impacts?
Yeah, it's a complex balancing act. It's designed to try and protect the lowest earners while still raising substantial revenue. The proposal involves a 2p increase in the basic rate of income tax, paired with a simultaneous 2p cut in national insurance contributions, or NI.
So why the swap? How does that help them thread the political needle, supposedly?
Well, national insurance is primarily a tax on earned income from wages. So by cutting NI by 2p, they can claim they're lowering the tax burden specifically on working people who earn standard wages. However, income tax applies to a much broader range of income, including rental income, investment income, and crucially, pension income.
Ah, okay. So the swap is targeted then. Who gets hit hardest by this?
It disproportionately hits two key groups that are defined as non-workers under the NI structure: pensioners and landlords. They don't benefit from the NI cut because they don't pay NI on pensions or rental income, but they face the full weight of the income tax increase. Furthermore, high earners, typically those earning over £75,000, will also pay thousands more in net tax. That's because the income tax increase for them generates much more revenue than the NI cut saves them. For example, some earners above £125,000 could see their annual tax bill jump by nearly £5,745.
The political risk here seems massive. Labor's deputy leader, Lucy Powell, already warned that breaking that manifesto pledge, regardless of how fiscally necessary the swap might be, would severely damage trust in politics.
It's a dilemma that really encapsulates the stress on the entire system, doesn't it? When financial necessity directly mandates breaking a foundational promise, political integrity inevitably becomes the primary casualty. The markets demand a resolution to the $30 billion hole, but the voters demand consistency and trust. And the two seem to be an irreconcilable conflict right now.
Okay, moving on to another financial pressure point where ethics and revenue collide. The Treasury Committee is urging the government to look again at how it taxes online betting games.
Yes, this is a classic taxing harm policy discussion. Requires quite a bit of nuance. The cross-party Treasury Committee issued a clear warning against what it called industry scaremongering. They urged the government to tax online betting games at a rate that reflects the actual social harm they cause, not just their economic contribution.
Why the specific focus on online betting rather than, say, traditional betting shops or horse racing?
Because the industry landscape has just fundamentally transformed in the last decade or so. Online betting games now account for 44% of the industry's total gross gambling yield. That's the total amount wagered minus winnings paid out. That 44% is a massive increase from only 12% back in 2014. So this shift means the majority of the sector's revenue is now generated by these high-frequency, often highly addictive digital products, things like slot machine simulations or instant win games online.
So the committee is basically arguing the taxation structure hasn't kept pace with this shift in technology and the associated social risk.
Exactly. They explicitly rejected the industry's kind of generalized assertion that gambling causes no social ills. They emphasized the highly addictive and harmful nature of these specific high-frequency online games. They noted the direct link to addiction and all the related financial, psychological, and social distress that follows. They want the tax rate to be weighted by the potential for societal damage, which would be a significant policy shift.
But the industry pushback, mainly through the Betting and Gaming Council, the BGC, was immediate and involves a classic regulatory warning, doesn't it?
Yes, the BGC's argument is sort of two-pronged. First, they warn that further tax increases risk achieving the opposite of what's intended. They say it could push players away from the licensed, regulated UK environment and towards the unsafe, unregulated black market online. This is the perennial fear in regulating any addictive substance or activity that excessive tax or regulation just empowers criminal enterprises.
And their second point is their economic contribution, I assume.
Correct. They stress their massive economic footprint. They highlight their £6.8 billion annual economic contribution, and also the vital funding they provide to British sport, which relies heavily on gambling sponsorship and related tax revenue. It's the ultimate regulatory balancing act, isn't it? How do you mitigate proven social harm without inadvertently bolstering the black market or damaging legitimate economic ecosystems that depend on that revenue?
And finally, rounding out our deep dive into accountability and institutional stress today, we have this matter of political ethics and transparency in appointments, specifically involving the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy.
Yes, and this connects back perfectly to that earlier discussion about political trust being eroded. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy breached the Public Appointments Code. She failed to declare past financial links to David Cogan. He was her nominee to lead the new independent football regulator, the IFR.
What exactly did she fail to declare? What was the breach?
The breach, which was highlighted by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, was administrative but significant in its implication for integrity. Nandy didn't immediately declare that Cogan had donated twice to her 2020 Labour leadership campaign. Furthermore, her department failed to declare Cogan's larger donations to the Labour Party itself, including contributions made to Kier Starmer's leadership campaign.
That seems like a pretty fundamental lapse in due diligence for such a high-profile public appointment. What was the consequence for Nandy?
Nandy issued an immediate apology. She said she deeply regretted this error and accepted the process was not entirely up to the standard expected. Kier Starmer accepted her apology. It's important to note, though, that Cogan's suitability for the actual IFR role itself wasn't challenged, and he was ultimately confirmed as the head.
So the structural failure here wasn't about political corruption as such, but more about bureaucratic failure. Failure to ensure total, absolute transparency in a process designed to be beyond reproach.
Exactly. It's a perfect microcosm of the theme running through our whole discussion today. Institutional discipline. Whether it's relying on a fax machine for prisoner records or relying on manual checklists for conflict of interest declarations. Even unintentional administrative slack can quickly escalate into an issue of profound political integrity. The expectation for officials in high office is, quite rightly, that they operate with a zero margin for error when it comes to transparency.
Yeah. It's astounding, isn't it, when you pull it all together? We've seen these huge systemic failures, from the decades-long cultural decay in policing that institutionalizes racism, to the administrative chaos in prisons that costs millions and risk public safety. And yet, the data also shows us where the fixes actually are.
That really is the essential takeaway, I think. We've charted a course through some monumental institutional failings today. The systemic stress is palpable. But the findings also highlight critical points where intervention could work. We have data showing that embedded racism is the clearest symptom of organizational dysfunction, and that needs structural change. And conversely, we have quantitative evidence that administrative chaos in prisons fueled by paper and inertia can be reversed by a simple commitment to digital empowerment.
Yeah, the reports show us systems under immense strain, definitely. But they also pinpoint where practical data-backed solutions exist, whether it's digitalizing those paper records still relying on 1980s tech, or making difficult but necessary legislative changes, like removing what Gordon Brown calls stains of prejudice and benefit caps. The answers are often available. They just seem to require a commitment to modernization and, well, ethical consistency.
The data on those PSS kiosks is truly profound, I agree. It shows giving prisoners digital autonomy and self-responsibility drastically cuts both internal misconduct and external reoffending rates. That's a statistically proven rehabilitation effect far exceeding comparison groups. The challenge for government, therefore, isn't always finding the answer to systemic stress. It's building the institutional discipline and the political will to overcome inertia and actually implement that answer, especially when implementation means letting go of outdated paternalistic forms of control.
Which raises an important and maybe provocative final question for you, our listener, to explore as you process this deep dive. We saw clear, quantifiable evidence that giving prisoners people under the highest level of institutional control more digital autonomy drastically cuts reoffending. So how might applying this exact principle, shifting systems away from paternalistic, paper-based control towards user self-responsibility and digital empowerment, how might that transform other areas of institutional failure? Could it work in policing, maybe by increasing transparency, or in welfare, by ensuring more dignity? The data suggests empowerment leads to better behavior, even in the most rigid environments. Something to think about.